mean, Marianne projects, and so do I. So welcome, everybody. I'm Laura Butterworth, and I'm so happy to be here in Louisville, Kentucky. It's such a friendly place. People have their smiles, and I know that tonight is Waterfront Wednesday. Waterfront Wednesday. You could all be there, but I'm grateful that you're here to hear about the adventures of being on the road with Marianne Williamson and then hearing her talk about what's going on in America. As I said, my name is Laura Butterworth. I live in Kennebunk, Maine. I'm an ambassador at large. I've been on the road for 8 months, and I go from city to city, town to town, to make sure that people know who Marianne Williamson is, since she hasn't been covered by the media, and also so that I can set up the venues and make sure that the venues are ready and the microphones work. I first heard about Marianne last March. It's been almost a year. I was in Concord, New Hampshire, and Marianne came to speak there, and I got my 2 grown daughters, and I said, let's do our civic duty. Let's go and hear this woman and see what she has to say. What I heard was disturbing. The thing that stood out the most, really, is Citizens United. Citizens United is a loophole that allows big corporations in America to donate to our politicians. When I heard this, I thought, I'm going to take some time off work and go and see if I can help publicize Marianne Williamson. Marianne Williamson, if you go to her issues page, you will see that she has many issues spelled out, and not only does she have them spelled out, she has the remedy. One of the things that I saw on the road was the success of the Roosevelt administration. President Roosevelt set up something called the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a remedy to the Great Depression, and it put millions of young people to work. Every young man, and they were all men at the time, every young man was required to send $20 a month home to his family. They were given food, they were given education. They built our bridges, they built our national parks, they built our state parks. And as I've been traveling and camping with my rooftop tent through the state and national parks, I have seen the successes. They used local stones, they used local timber, and the knowledge of the people. I actually saw the Roosevelt Museum with my co-volunteer, Carl, last week, and I also learned about his wife, Eleanor, and the good that she did to include the black population, to cut down on discrimination, and also to bring women into the forefront of the knowledge. Marianne Williamson is one of our greatest teachers in the United States, and you'll see why. And she is naming what she sees in our government that needs to be addressed. So today, welcome again, Marianne Williamson, our light. Thank you.
Because that was pretty much as real as it gets. emerged, sort of organically unfolded, a career in which I found myself often with people during their darkest moments. The joke at the time almost was, nobody calls Marianne because things are going well. And I was there when the test results came back. Cancer, AIDS, you find your child is addicted to heroin. Someone you love has just died. It was a privilege, really, all the times that I have been invited into people's lives in their most agonizing hours. But when my career began in the 1980s, certainly in the experiences that I was going through with people, but also it seems to me in the country in which we live, times of crisis were the exception. They weren't the rule. This was something people were going through, and then on the other side of that, you would hopefully have a life that was not filled with crisis. About 20 years later, I began to sense a change, and I noticed how often I was talking to people whose lives were in crisis. But the crisis wasn't the exception, the crisis was the rule. The crisis wasn't just that you had cancer, the crisis was that you didn't have health care. And the crisis wasn't just that you were looking for a job, the crisis was you had to work for it to be able just to be able to put enough food on your table for your children. And I began to realize that this wasn't just true of the individuals I was talking to. I saw how America had changed. You know, when I was growing up, we could have a crisis. And the crisis was the exception, it wasn't the rule. Now it's like we're living in a permanent state of crisis. It's always something. If it's not an economic crisis, it's an environmental crisis, it's a health crisis, there's always a crisis. And we're living in that permanent state where what is going on that it is so common that things aren't working for people? What is going on that it is so common that things really aren't working for the country? And I began to realize during that time, around the turn of the century, that in many, many cases, the problem was at least indirectly due to bad public policy. If somebody's got cancer, the bigger problem isn't in the cancer. I mean, cancer is bad enough, but you've also got to deal with the fact that your insurance won't cover everything. And the stress of that and the anxiety of that, that's public policy. Began to see so many of the things that people call the mental health crisis. I would look at how many people were living with constant economic stress. How could you not be anxious? How could you not be chronically living in tension and anxiety? Especially since today, 70% of Americans say that they live in constant economic anxiety. And so that was what led me to the point where I realized that you can't just say to someone like myself, help people make it through these times, okay? You can't just say to clergy and therapists and coaches and all that kind of stuff. Help people to endure these times. Not the richest country in the world. That doesn't make sense. Help them endure these times. Well, the reason there's so many wars is because these times are unjust. So instead of helping people survive this time so redolent with economic injustice, why don't we just end the injustice? Now, I've also found the extraordinary resistance of the system to someone who says that. But that's a little bit later in the story. I have run for president because I have felt, having had a career for over 40 years, having had a career so in which being inauthentic isn't even possible. You know, if somebody just found out they had cancer, their child has cancer, someone they love died, making it anything but real isn't even an option. And when it comes to our collective experience, we need to be real also. Now, you could take any two people who are here tonight who don't know each other, and you go out to dinner afterwards, okay? I think it's reasonable to assume that by the end of 30 minutes, by the end of the time, your entree comes, you're aware which of you, if not both of you, are in therapy. And which of you, if not both of you, are in a toxic relationship. Which one, if not both of you, have had trauma in your life that you've had to deal with. Which of you, if not both of you, have had abusive situations in your life. We're very programmed in our society today to be deeply analytical and deeply focused on deeper dynamics when it comes to me, when it comes to my life, to the life of the individual. But when it comes to our collective experiences and what we're going through in this country, we've been trained to keep it shallow. We've been trained in our collective conversations to think like sixth graders. We've been trained when it comes to coming together to talk about the things that are not about you or you or you, but us. We have been trained to farm out our best thinking. Now, one of the things that I felt when I ran for president last time, and I feel just as much this time, people would ask me this question. I have the same answer. This time, I would say times 10. What was your experience running for president? And I've always said, because this is my truth, number one, the system is even more corrupt than I feared, and people are even more wonderful than I hoped. I can tell you, as someone who has traveled this country, and I've traveled this country not only this time, remember, I did this before. Now, I've had a 40-year career traveling the country, but I mean, even talking about political issues such as we're talking about tonight, the American people are not the problem. Please remember that I said that to you. The American people are not the problem. We are as decent and intelligent as anyone else. I'm not saying more so, but no less. And we are open to our noble selves when someone calls us to our nobility. Americans were programmed to do great things. This country grew out of a great idea. This country grew out of the notion we can start over. We can do it different than we've done it before. That's what this country was founded on. And as a matter of fact, when we're not called to great things, we're like wilted flowers. We're called to do something great. Our ancestors have done something great. But we have a political system which, instead of being a conduit for the emergence of our better selves, for the emergence of the angels of our better nature, for the emergence of our collective wisdom, is actually more than not an obstruction to it. Because that force that we have acquiesced to, that force that we've given up our best thinking, or farmed out our most critical thought processes to, is quite simply a political elite. It is a political, media, industrial complex. And that political, media, industrial complex is part of a large system, a matrix of corporate overlords, which are in fact a sign of a regression on the part of the American mind to the very archetype of aristocracy that we repudiated in 1776. In 1776, we repudiated the idea that only a few people got to win. Only a few people in those days had the land. Only a few people in those days had the wealth. Only a few people in those days had the opportunity to greater wealth creation. And it was just kind of accepted that everybody else was to basically live their lives in service to them. Well, excuse me, wasn't this country founded in repudiation of that? Mm-hmm. So I'd like to, in order for us to have the deepest kind of analysis, an analysis and thinking about our country that matches the deeper analysis and thinking about our own lives that we feel permitted to participate in. Let's go back to the beginning. So we have a deeper understanding of what happened here. Because it's like when you go back in your family, you go back in your religion, you go back in your ethnicity, you go back and you find out how this happened that you're here, and it empowers you. You get, well, if I know what my ancestors did and how they got here, it gives me a sense of what I owe my ancestors, and also I think gives us a sense of what we owe our own descendants. It gives us a sense of where we live in the historical arc of things. Now, I honor that we're living at a time when everybody's into their silo. My religion, my sex, my sexuality, my ethnicity, all that's important. I'm not minimizing it. But at the same time, in order for us to have the deeper conversation now, we must come out of our silos. On one hand, we say how awful it is that we're all so polarized, but too often we're polarized in our own thinking by keeping it about me. We can't just think about ourselves, but we also can't just think about our group, our sex, our sexuality, our color. There's a term in alchemy called separatio, where you separate out all the elements to perfect them. However, the point is though that they might join at a higher level. So, one of our first principles is e pluribus unum, out of many, one. You're Jewish and American, you're gay and American, you're black and American. It's the American part I want to talk to you about tonight. Sometimes people say, who are you're talking to. I don't think that so much as who I'm talking to, but the place in your heart that I'm talking to. And I say your heart as well as your mind. You know, there's a man named Dr. James Doty, who is a neurosurgeon at Stanford University. And he wrote a wonderful book called Into the Magic Shop. I really highly recommend it. And he said, I either read this in his something he wrote, or I heard him say this, I can't remember. But he was talking about how in surgery and neurology, et cetera, that they have always thought that the brain was the intelligence center of the body. But now they're discovering that there's more of a highway between the head and the heart, between the brain and the heart than they used to think. There's more of a partnership between the brain and the heart that forms a real intelligence center of the body. Well, I think that we need to think of that not only in relation to the body, but in terms of all society. You've got to have the brain and the heart working together. If your heart doesn't work with your brain doesn't work with your heart, your life's not going to work as well as it might, and neither is your society. So let's go back to 1776. 1776, 56 very brave men signed the Declaration of Independence. In the Jewish religion, it says every generation must rediscover God for itself. Now, the Declaration of Independence is our mission statement. The Declaration of Independence is our North Star. Now, forgive me for a minute. This is going to sound stupid. There was Abraham Lincoln is either born in Illinois, raised in Kentucky, or born in Kentucky, raised in Illinois. Which is he was born here.
Yeah.
And lived in Indiana as well as.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. The Declaration of Independence was referred to by Abraham Lincoln as an eternal rebuke to all systems of tyranny and oppression. But going back to the Jews saying it, every generation has to rediscover the power of God for itself. Every generation of Americans has to rediscover for ourselves, what does the Declaration of Independence mean to me? What does the Declaration of Independence mean to our generation? If it's simply inscribed on marble wall somewhere, if those principles are merely written in parchment and they're put under glass, and when our kids are in the 8th grade, we send them on a field trip to see them in a museum, oh, we've done our civic duty. That's not enough. Those principles have to be inscribed on our hearts, on every generation's heart, or else they lose their life force. And when that happens, quite simply, we become very easy to write. So what are they? What are those principles that 56 very brave men signed in 1776? By the way, mentioned twice already, brave. Why were they brave? They were brave because if the British had won the war, they would have all been hanged as traitors against the King of England. With signing this document, they infused not only into the founding of a country, they infused into the ethers of human possibility on this planet a set of ideals so radical, representing such a radical departure from entrenched institutional systems of injustice and domination and control that the world would never be the same again. These principles have never been fully actualized. The whole point of every generation, quote unquote, in order to form a more perfect union, meaning it's a continuing effort that every generation has to take on for itself to provide a fuller actualization and manifestation of these principles. Once again, how can you do that if you're really taking in what they are? Number one, all men are created equal. That was radical in 1776. It's radical today. So instead of the idea, remember when we were kids, I remember being, elementary school or middle school, the divine right of kings. Remember? The Sun King, all that stuff in Europe, that God had given special power to the king. This was like, no, all men are created equal. All men with the inalienable rights given by their creator of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. What would we call that today? Self-actualization? civilization. You have a right to do whatever you want to do. Go for it. You want to do this? Go for it. You want to do that? Go for it. Fly as high as your wings will take you. Do whatever you want. Have fun. Be happy. As long as you don't hurt anyone else. God gave you that right. Radical in, radical out. Number 3, governments are instituted in order to secure those rights. Not undercut those rights, not chop away those rights, not diminish those rights. Governments, their very purpose is to secure those rights. And number 4, which is the most radical of all, if government is not doing its job, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. Now, once again, that's enlightened stuff. That's enlightened stuff, not only politically, but also spiritually and morally. That's where it started, but we're not stupid. We also know where it got gnarly. Because 41 of the 56 signers were slave owners. So, that dichotomy has always been with us. That dichotomy is the American story. That dichotomy is baked into the cake. It's America's characterological DNA. It's the big both and of who we are. And that DNA represents and embodies a story that has been reiterated generation after generation from the very beginning, even unto our own. We are a country which is filled with people who get, wow, this is big. And people who have been willing to suffer for those ideals and struggle for those ideals, and in some cases, even die for those ideals. Ideals which represent not only profound rights that we are given here. I mean, there are countries in the world, particularly as a woman, if I was up here saying a fraction of the things that I'm saying tonight, I would be hauled off. I could be tortured. I could be imprisoned. I could be killed. And also the fact no policeman's going to come in tonight and tell us to break it up. And this is a serious thing, these rights we're given by this. But it also, and I hope that all of us leave here tonight with this deep and sober recognition, it also gives us profound responsibilities. The responsibility to make sure that in our time, those principles, those rights are not only applied, but that we do what we can to even expand them so that they have ever greater application to more and more people, and also so that they are protected against assault from anyone trying to mess with them, either in this country or from abroad. Now, what do those two represent? First of all, there's the people who get how big this is, how beautiful this is, how profound this is, not only for our country, but for the world. But there have been also people, started with slave owners, but representing that consciousness in every generation since, of people who, for their own ideological and or financial purposes, had no intention whatsoever of seeing those principles made manifest, wasn't convenient for them, and would prove over and over again, and still do, that they would do whatever it would take in order to ensure that they were not. That struggle has always been with us. Every generation has lived it out, some more dramatically than others. So then you ask yourself, well, how did our ancestors handle this? What is the arc of American history then? Well, you realize that our ancestors were very impressive, thank you very much. Our ancestors rose up against slavery with abolition. Our ancestors rose up against the institutional suppression of women with the women's suffragist movement, the passage of the 19th Amendment. Our ancestors rose up against the financial inequities of the first Gilded Age and established organized labor. And our generations rose up against segregation and the institutionalized suppression of black people in the American South with the Civil Rights Movement, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act. I've been running for president for the last year because it's our turn now. It's our turn now because we in our time are living out that same struggle It is as serious now. It represents as much of a peril to American democracy as any other generation has faced. And we too, in our time, are faced with the challenge, and I believe the responsibility to course correct this country, as other generations have course corrected it in their time. Now, in our generation, and by generation, one of the silos we have to come out of is this age thing. I don't care if you're 18 or 80, I'm talking to you. Because if we're the adults at this time, that's who needs to take this on, the adults, right? Now, our issue is not a specific institution. It's not a specific institution like slavery or segregation. It's an economic paradigm. It's the very thought that somehow short-term profits for huge corporations should actually be placed before consideration for the safety and the health and the well of the American people and our children and the planet on which we live. And this economic paradigm has so infused the functioning of our government and the functioning of every quarter of American society as to be an oppressive force. There is a matrix of corporate overlords, and these corporate overlords represent big pharmaceutical companies, big insurance companies, big food companies, big agricultural companies, big chemical companies, big oil companies, and defense contractors. Now, there is such a thing as righteous profit, and I believe there's such a thing as righteous capitalism. The man who actually first articulated free market capitalism, Adam Smith, said it cannot exist outside an ethical context. What has happened is a malevolent strain of capitalism, which is so disconnected from ethical consideration, which is so disconnected from soulfulness, which is so disconnected from a sense, well, of course people's health comes first. Of course the health of the planet comes first. Of course peace comes first. No. Not if your only bottom line is profit for your shareholders. If your only bottom line and your only fiduciary responsibility is to your stockholders, then sorry, it's good. If you have a big food company and the big food company determines that there is a particular ingredient that will increase the shelf life of the product, that means that the stockholder value will be greater, but the carcinogenic, the people's exposure to carcinogenic ingredients will be greater. But this economic system says, well, that's just too bad. I'm sure many of you probably saw that piece that went viral a few months ago about the ketchup bottle in the United States versus the ketchup bottle in Canada. It's extraordinary. In issue after issue after issue, there are carcinogens in our food. That are not even allowed in other countries. So you have the same company that makes one product for the United States and another product for every other advanced democracy. But let's go back from the very beginning. Why don't we have universal health care in this country? Every other advanced democracy has universal health care. They say it's complicated. It's not complicated, it's corrupt. The reason we don't have universal health care is for one reason only, and that's